Good evening. I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of campaign group Transparency Task Force. We are a UK-based certified social enterprise with a formal purpose. Our mission formally is, and these words are verbatim, to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. So we're all about the idea that the financial industry is profoundly important to economic well-being, political stability, and of course, personal financial security for citizens. And whilst we acknowledge and recognize its remarkable importance to society, we also are very alive to the fact that it does have a pretty high predisposition to misbehave. And of course, perhaps the greatest situation where the sector has misbehaved is the activity that led to the global financial crisis, which of course caused economic turmoil and immense human suffering around the world. Without getting too bleak about it, it is a matter of fact that according to Oxford University research, and I'll reference this in the chat later, approximately 10,000 people took their own lives as a direct consequence of the global financial crisis. The economic turmoil it created, the depression that followed, resulted in many people around the world losing their jobs, their economic well-being. That caused immense personal and family pressures. And as I've said, 10,000 people plus across the UK, mainland Europe, Canada, and the USA took their lives. You may be wondering, what on earth has that got to do with tonight's session? Well, I will explain, and I'll be very, very blunt about it. We think tonight's conversation about the book by John Bowers KC, who are, remarkably pleased is with us tonight, the book Downward Spiral by John Bowers KC, all about the decay in public standards and how they should be restored, is epicentral, at the very epicenter of the work that we do. Why do I say that? Well, because whilst in the first few years of running the Financial Services Campaign Group Transparency Task Force, whilst in the first few years, we were very focused on misconduct by the organizations. It is a harsh reality that as time has gone by, we have become increasingly concerned with the ineffectiveness of the public bodies to do what they're there to do. I'm talking about public bodies such as the Financial Conduct Authority and the Financial Ombudsman Service and others. In particular, I'm talking about the way that the Financial Conduct Authority, it would seem, has been pulled in different directions by different forces. Broadly speaking, forces that wanted to champion the interests of the City of London, and on our side of the equation, those who wanted to do a better job protecting consumers from harm. Now, it's just an interesting coincidence that today was the first of a two-day court hearing in the Royal Courts of Justice, where an all-party parliamentary group, a group of elected representatives, have taken the Financial Conduct Authority to court. I'll explain a bit more about the case later as it becomes relevant, but essentially, the heart of this case is, as I would put it, the Financial Conduct Authority's either unwillingness or inability to stand up for the interests of small business owners who were grotesquely mistreated by their banks, and the Financial Conduct Authority's decisions to not mandate the banks to pay compensation to the people that all the evidence suggests they harmed. In the past, I've referenced the Financial Conduct Authority's behavior in relation to this matter as it being morally bankrupt. These are very, very strong words. I know they are very, very strong words. So to my mind, ladies and gentlemen, there is a very close real-life connection between the nature of the topic that John Bowers KC has written about in Downward Spiral and the real-life experience that many people are having to go through as a consequence of the collapse in public standards as far as a regulatory body is concerned. More about that later. Meanwhile, allow me to set the scene regarding John's book. The Johnson era will be remembered for a series of scandals that severely eroded trust in the British government, from questionable PPE tenders and public appointments to the Partygate fiasco. Every aspect of public life seemed tainted. How did this downward spiral begin? And what can be done to reverse it? In this eye-opening book, veteran KC John Bowers presents a fearless examination of the decline in ethical standards before, during, and after the Johnson government. He focuses on the institutions responsible for holding the government accountable, exposing how they have been bypassed by prime ministers determined to impose the agenda. Through interviews with political insiders, Bowers provides analysis of scandals such as Partygate, Greensill, and the revolving door with the private sector. He shines a light on a culture of favoritism, where standards are upheld based on little more than the assumption those in power can be trusted to behave. I did once upon a time think like that those in power can be trusted to behave. Rishi Sunak entered number 10 on the promise of restoring integrity, but it is clear major problems remain. Confronting the failings of the current system, Downward Spiral presents concrete proposals for creating an alternative that is more transparent and more accountable. John Bowers KC, sir, what you have written about is so relevant to so many people, including the 10,750, I think it is, individuals who have been, in my opinion, prevented from accessing justice due to the calamitous conduct of our primary conduct regulator, but also the victims of many other kinds of financial shenanigans that have been going on. But please do tell us about your book, talk us through why you wrote it, what the key conclusions are. And having done that, John, please speak for as long as you wish. We'll open up the conversation, for example, as well as getting everyone else a chance to share what their thoughts are. I'll be particularly interested to see what Carolyn Hayman has to say, Robert Delner, and one or two others as well, because what you've written about, sir, is very relevant to our work as a community of campaigners. Thank you all very much indeed for being here. Can we please show our appreciation first of all to John Bowers KC, and then we'll pass over to John to pick up from there. Thank you very much indeed, all. Thank you. John Bowers KC, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the previous event that I joined you on. And as Andy said, when Rishi Sunak went into number 10, he said that this government will have integrity, professionalism and accountability at its core. And Keir Starmer said something quite similar. And they did so in order to draw a line under the controversial Johnson era in particular, because trust in government was at that stage at a historic low and fast corroding. The British Social Attitude Survey found that trust in government was at 15%, all or most of the time. And as Gus O'Donnell, former cabinet secretary, told me for the book, where there is a higher level of trust, well-being is likely to be greater. Lack of trust is likely to be corrosive in institutions. And we know what the gold standard for government should be. That's the terms of the Nolan, which was set up under John Major's watch to serve as an ethical watchdog. And you know the 7 principles: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. One can't really think that those principles were open on the desk of Boris Johnson. His period of office was probably the first time since Lloyd George when the very role of Prime Minister has raised issues of sleaze. you could say that the British system of governance was like the proverbial fish rotting from the head down. And there was, for a long time, a prevalent view amongst the public that whilst they knew Johnson was a rogue, they thought he was our rogue. So the scandals during his time were effectively priced in. But what I wanted to do was to look at how the system of ethical regulation, the so-called fourth or fifth estate of government, would react when there was someone in office who didn't fit the label of being a good chap, which is Peter Hennessy's theory that in Britain, without a written constitution, the constitution works informally by the Prime Minister being responsible for the ethics in the public sector. And what happened was that Johnson himself was not one for obeying rules. He flouted the rules willfully, and worse still, flaunted the flouting, and indeed promoted people who had themselves flouted the rules. Now, you could say that the system eventually reasserted itself because, of course, Johnson had to resign, and you could say that he was brought down by a series of ethical scandals, curiously, all of them beginning with a P. So you had the Patel issue, where the permanent secretary said that he was bullied by Priti Patel. Instead of Miss Patel resigning, the only people who resigned were the permanent secretary and the advisor on ministerial interests, who looked into that and whose advice was not accepted. If you recall, Johnson, instead of criticizing her, told his MPs to form a square around the Pritzker, as he called her. And in fact, she finished up with damehood granted by Johnson. Then there was the Patterson scandal, where one of his friends, Owen Patterson, who had been a key Brexiteer, broke parliamentary rules. Instead of the government accepting the report of the Parliamentary Standards Commission, which would have provided possibly for a recall petition, the government whipped its MPs into overturning the result of that, indeed retrospectively. It's quite interesting. In his autobiography, Unleashed, which I've read so that you don't have to, Johnson puts his case on Patterson and says that it was all a lot of nonsense, as indeed he does on Partygate, which was the third P, which almost brought him down, because that was a scandal that was very easy to understand. It was one law for people at Number 10 who made the rules, and a different law for everybody else. But he fell finally over the Chris Pincher scandal when the deputy chief whip was involved in sexual misconduct at the Carlton Club, of all places. And Johnson, when asked whether he knew that there were problems with Pincher and whether he'd said Pincher by name, Pincher by nature, claimed that he had no idea, where Simon MacDonald, who was the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office, said that he knew full well, and that led to resignations. Now, there was a fifth P, it was slightly different to the others, and that's the prorogation of Parliament, which, as you recall, led unusually to a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court that was unlawful. So what I wanted to do was to look at the system which is intended to keep politics straight, and to see whether Johnson as Prime Minister merely revealed the weakness in the rules, or whether there were a lack of rules. But I'm not suggesting that Johnson was one-off. There were, of course, there have always been scandals over the years. New Labour, let's not forget, started with the Eccleston affair, where Eccleston, the head of Formula One, was given a carve-out from the ban on tobacco advertising, he having given £1 million to the Labour Party, and there were all sorts of Tony's cronies row as well. So it didn't start with Johnson, but I do think that the Johnson government was different because of this concept of someone at the centre who could not be relied on to be a good chap. So what I'll do in the balance of the time when I speak, I'd be very interested to hear what others think, is look at the ethical watchdogs and what should happen to them. Of course, I should say that the book was published just before the election, so it didn't deal with Starmer. And I must admit, I thought that this would be a period of good ethical standards. It certainly didn't start well with Glasses Gate and the taking of money for private things from Lord Alley. I don't think that was quite on the scale of the Johnsonian problems, but it certainly is not a good look. And there have been a couple of appointments issues as well. Now, Labour did come in saying that they would change the ethical regulation landscape by having a single ethics regulator. I'll come to that in a minute, but I just want to look briefly at some of the ethical bodies. So the first is the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Interests, who looks at conflicts of interest and also anything that's referred to him, and it has so far only been a man. Now, both advisors under Johnson, Sir Alex Allen, a former permanent secretary, and Lord Geit, who had worked mainly in the royal household, both resigned. And what was clear is that, firstly, there's nothing to require the Prime Minister to accept the advice. And the independent advisor has no statutory background to it. I think it's important that that advisor is only selected on the with the approval of the opposition. It shouldn't be a party political post. It should have a statutory backing so that it can't be abolished without Parliament looking at it. There was a lot of speculation that Johnson would indeed abolish it. Indeed, it was unfilled for 10 months between Allen resigning and Lord Geidt being appointed. I also think it's important that the independent advisor should have the power to initiate reviews rather than only acting on the say-so of the Prime Minister. The second is the Commissioner for Public Appointments. Again, that role is not a statutory role. As you probably know, under Johnson, slightly less so under Sunak. There were a whole series of issues about public appointments. Certainly was virtually impossible for Labour supporters or even Remain supporting Conservatives to be appointed to major boards. And the Conservative government politicised what had previously been thought to be non-political roles, particularly in the culture sector. So appointments to museums became politicised, to the Charity Commission also. And what's clear is that the Commissioner for Public Appointments really has no power to prevent appointments that are made otherwise than on merit or by committees that are packed politically, as was the panel for choosing the chairman of the office for students, which in my world is a very significant role. So again, I think that there should be statutory backing for the Commissioner of Public Appointments. He should be able to prevent appointments made in breach of the rules. The third is the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. As you will probably know, this deals with applications from former ministers and senior civil servants who wish to take roles in the private sector. The danger to be guarded against is that improper advantage may be given to companies, groups, or think tanks with which a minister or civil servant is dealing, because the person is influenced by the fact that he or she may be seeking a berth there after the tenure in the public office is complete. In the words of the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case, it is to, quote, stop people making direct personal financial gain from the privileged information that they have gained in government. And in the interviews for the book, I came across some real scandalous cases in the defense industry of people being involved in defense contracts and then going to senior positions in the very few defense contracting companies. Now, this is an unregulated area. The clue in the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments is in the name. It is advisory. It has no legal teeth. Several ministers did not put their appointments through this, although they should have done, and that includes George Osborne and Nadine Dorries. Again, I think it should be put on a statutory basis and be given real legal teeth. The fourth is the House of Lords Appointments Committee. That's again an advisory, non-departmental public body. It's only advisory. There's an extraordinary correlation between gifts to the parties and appointments to the House of Lords. Several lords have been turned down by the House of Lords Appointments Committee, but have still been able to be appointed, including Lord Lebedev, who glories in the title of Lord Lebedev of London Borough of Richmond and Siberia, and Lord Cruddas of Shoreditch. So again, this body has no real teeth. These are the four bodies that I think really should be reformed, along with the registrar of consultant lobbyists. You recall, in particular, the Greensill scandal, where David Cameron was lobbying on behalf of Greensill, which was a starter bank. He was lobbying for access to various COVID schemes, and his lobbying was not covered by the Registrar of Consultant Lobbyists because he was not an employed lobbyist. Indeed, only about 3% of lobbyists are regulated by the registrar, who works only for 30 to 40 days a year, and the rest of the time, I mean, he seemed a very pleasant person, but the rest of the time he runs a business coaching executives. So again, there's very little regulation of lobbyists. And I don't want to paint a completely adverse picture, because there are some bodies that do a good job. I'll pick out two. I think the Electoral Commission, one can disagree with some of their findings, but the Electoral Commission has real enforcement powers, and basically can operate to prevent abuses of the electoral system. I think that the Committee on Standards in Public Life also does a good job. It is the forward body that came out of the Nolan report, and its reviews of ethical regulation are given great respect. But I do conclude that we shouldn't just say, well, Johnson's period of lack of ethical buoyancy can be ignored. I do think there should be reform of the system. As I say, the Labour Party in opposition, no doubt under Sue Gray's influence, came up with the idea of a single ethical regulator. I personally would prefer a system that doesn't have a single commission, because I think there's a single point of failure. So if something goes wrong with the appointments there, then the whole system breaks down. I would favour a toughening up of the system under an overall regulator, which I think would be most appropriate, the Committee on Standards in Public Life, so that they could at any time decide which of these bodies would carry out investigations. Because looking at it from the other end of the system, you do get the situation where in some scandals there are various different bodies investigating them. So in Greensill, there were no less than 4 investigations. In that case, all of them cohered in the result. But on number 10 refurbishment, if you recall, the refurbishment of number 10 was carried out in a private way, and the independent advisor on ministerial interests effectively gave Johnson a clean bill of health, whereas the Electoral Commission found that there had been breaches. So again, I think it would be more efficient to have one body who decides how the investigation should carry on. So I think at the risk of this becoming more legally complex, I do think that it's important that these bodies are rationalized, put on a statutory basis, given proper investigative resources, and that there should be one single body looking at each scandal. So that's really what I wanted to say, but very interested what people think of that.
John, thank you so much. You've set out so many talking points for us. You really have. It's been great to hear your whistle-stop tour through this whole area. If I may, I'll kick off with a few comments and questions myself, and then we'll open it up to others. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll seek input, particularly from Carolyn Hayman and Robert Delner and David Hooper and everybody else. John, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Am I right in thinking that anybody that opposes the kind of reforms that you have suggested, which to my mind all seem rather pragmatic and very purposeful, anybody opposing that kind of thing, would we have reason to be suspicious of them? Why would anybody get in the way of such progressive reforms? I don't see where the opposition could come from, apart from those who, for some reason, want to maintain some kind of opaque status quo where everything happens in the shadows and there's not much accountability or transparency. I ask this being somebody who's passionate about the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Yeah. So where would the opposition come from for the kind of reforms that you're proposing, John, if anywhere?
Well, I think some people oppose them because they say that it makes it more legalistic, and with legalism comes lawyers and delay. But I think it's a price worth paying. Some people think, as indeed Boris Johnson in his book, that a lot of these things have been exaggerated for political reasons. But I personally think that these scandals are what has contributed to a lack of trust in politics, and that's very serious.
I think it is serious. The trust deficit towards our political framework, our regulatory framework, our institutions. I would say for the second half of my life, I'm 61 now, I would say the second half of my life has been characterized by the drip, drip, drip of adverse publicity as a direct consequence of one kind of failure in ethical standards or another. And it's almost as though people are becoming expectant of people to not do the right thing. It's almost as if people are expecting that others will allow things like conflicts of interest and the revolving door problem and regulatory failure or political capture, all kind of conspiring to create this incentives framework that almost enables the kind of things that we are talking about to happen.
I think that's right. And of course, it's not confined to the UK. I
Of
noticed
course.
something. I think that your good self put in the chat about Trump. I
Mm,
mean, the conflict of interest rules seem to have been completely ignored. I mean, not least his pivot to cryptocurrency,
yes.
which
Yes.
originally called a scam, and he and or his family have bought up a cryptocurrency firm now. So I think it is it's a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, it is we shouldn't be too nostalgic about this. There was never a time when there were these sort of giants of ethics wandering around. But I think, I mean, if you just test it by John Major setting up a Nolan committee, I can't see Johnson having done that. It just seems impossible to imagine.
I think you might be right. This is such an interesting topic, and it's so relevant to our work, as I said earlier. John, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts thus far. We'll go to Carolyn. Carolyn, please do take a moment. Your timing's perfect. I just saw you put your hand up at the split second I mentioned your name. Please take a moment to introduce yourself and the organisation you're now leading, because it's clearly relevant to this topic. Carolyn, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm a Quaker. I'm just stopping being a trustee of the Quakers nationally, and I'm a member of the Network for Social Change, which is a group giving activity. We started to look at labour rights because of the declining share of labour in the national output, which has gone from 55% of the share of value to 45% in 40 years, which has had an obvious impact on inequality and people's incomes. And one of the things that we're doing is we're running a new organising conference, really to sort of fight against a different kind of exploitation, which is the exploitation of workers by companies. Obviously, not all companies, but you look at things like 0 hours contracts where the risk has been transferred entirely from the company onto some of the most insecure workers in a sort of very obvious transfer of power. So what the new organising conference is aiming to do really is to address that balance of power by encouraging people to learn organising techniques from each other and collaborate with each other. One of the other projects in the Labour Rights Major Project is Violation Tracker, which Andy was very much involved in setting up. And, one simple thing that could be done is when people are considered for honours, the committee could look at the track record of the companies that they've led. And if the company has had systematic violations for environment or pension fraud or the wage theft, then maybe they should think about that rather than the scandals coming out once people have been appointed. I wanted to ask two questions. One's a really, really naive and stupid question, which is if these bodies were on a statutory basis, what difference would that have made in the case of let's pick a scandal, Partygate? What difference would it have made to Boris Johnson? Would he have been hauled off in chains or what? And then my other observation is that I think there's always been bad behavior, both in corporates, in all aspects of life. But what I think is different is that politicians seem to now have lost the ability to resign if they're found out in a lie. And I think of the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and I can't remember her name, but she told a direct lie in Parliament. She said that that Universal Credit was going really well, and that its National Statistics Office wrote to her and said, "This is not true. It's actually going really badly." I'm kind of summarizing. And I think in the old days, someone who was blatantly lying to Parliament would have had to resign. And I think the difference is that that's gone out of fashion somehow. So it's not that people behaved better in the past necessarily, but I think there was more of a sense of shame. So that was my two pennyworths.
No, that's absolutely fascinating, and well done on your new organization. If I take the two questions you asked in turn, and then I'd like to comment on a couple of other things you said. Rendering these bodies statutory would mean that they couldn't be abolished without consideration in Parliament. And if they had enforcement powers, then they would have teeth, which at the moment they don't have. Now, you may say, well, a government with a big majority could abolish them anyway, but it would be a matter that would have to go through Parliament. The independent advisor role was very to being abolished under Johnson, so it would prevent that. In terms of Partygate, it probably wouldn't have had any effect, but of course that was already criminal under the COVID laws. I mean, one of the issues there is whether the government or whether the police use their powers sufficiently there, because there were several parties that were never investigated. It's never been clear, so certainly to me, as to why some were and some weren't. I think you're right about resignation. Less apparent compulsion to resign. I don't think that is confined to politics. Actually, I mean, there's plenty of situations where you might expect people in the city to resign who don't. And the whole idea of responsibility of a minister for the department seems to have gone. I think you're right. The degree of shame, and as someone as you've said, it was Esther McVey who told a lie and didn't resign. No, I don't really want to get into Brexit, but you could say that there were many lies told during that campaign, and maybe we should have a law preventing political lies. Just going back to very briefly a couple of things that you said. I mean, my day job before I came to Oxford was as an employment lawyer, and I agree with you. 0 hours contracts are a very serious abuse. I think that this government does seem to be backpedaling on abolishing them, and I think that is unfortunate. And I do agree with you about honours, that they should take into account people's ethical conduct. I think it's. I noticed that 2 people were stripped of honours. I think it was the end of last week, but that's incredibly rare. And I do think these things should be taken into account.
Thank you very much indeed, John, and thank you, Karen, for those points that led to a very interesting exchange there. In a short while, we'll go to David Hooper to get his reflections on this topic. But before we do, John, the book's called Downward Spiral, and you've suggested there could be some reforms that might change things. But what are your gut instincts telling you? Are they telling you that things are bad, getting worse, and you can't see anything changing the current direction of travel? Or are you genuinely hopeful that there's going to be some kind of inflection point that's going to cause a rebound effect, or the pendulum starting to swing back the other way? How do you see the future? How bleak do you think it might become? And I ask this as someone who's quite mindful of what it must be like for the younger generation now, looking up, inverted commas, at the elders and not seeing that many good examples around.
Yeah.
If we take that kind of intergenerational dimension into account, is there reason to actually be quite bleak about this? Because how and why would we expect the generation coming after us to behave better than we have if, frankly, they've just been exposed to poor standards throughout their entire lives? Whereas, at least for me, first half of my life, there was pretty good standards around as far as I could see. Now
Yeah.
it's not. Whereas for that generation, it's been bad from the moment they entered the earth.
I
Forgive me
mean,
being so bleak, but what are your thoughts around that kind of intergenerational dimension to this, and
yeah.
whether things are just going to get worse and worse and worse?
I mean, it's unusual for a 68-year-old person to be interacting with young people a lot. But as principal of a college, I do that all the time. And you're right, there's great cynicism about the political process. Very few of our students are intending to go into party politics. They may go into single issue politics. I think it can be turned round, and I must admit, without being party political about it, I did think that Keir Starmer would turn it round, given that he's a lawyer, he's very procedurally driven, he was done contributions, but it wasn't a good start. And I think that they have put this agenda on hold, actually, because I think that they're worried that if it does come back, and they do have an ethical commission, all the headlines about acceptance of glasses and passes for glasses. Lord Ali was allowed free rein in number 10 would come back. I think, I mean, the number of MPs who were suspended during the Johnson years was absolutely frightening. I think at one time there were about 25 MPs who were suspended from their parties or had been involved in criminal matters. Except for that MP who assaulted one of his constituents late night, I think it was 3 a.m. in the Northwest. I don't think there have been any issues with these in this parliament. So maybe the current crop of people are better from that point of view. But I see no sign that lobbying is being brought under control. Indeed, many people from lobbying companies have moved into the Labour government, as with the Tory government before it.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I didn't detect a huge amount of optimism
No,
about the
no,
next
you're right.
generation. I think I'm worried you're right. Maybe there's going to be some cataclysmic situation that causes a rebound. You know, that's where my fingers are crossed around that. In a moment, we're going to hear from David Hooper. And as you've seen in the chat, David spoke about his excellent book a few months ago. And it's through David that we got to know John. It's been lovely to get to know both of them. But before we do, we'll go to Mark Bannister, who put his hand up. Mark, please do share your thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bowes, for your exposition of all of these various disasters, some of which I'd forgotten, but I'm pleasantly reminded, or perhaps unpleasantly reminded, but I've got to be somewhat rude to you, and I don't hope you'll not take this offensively personally, but I take grave exception to the fact that because Keir Starmer is a lawyer, he might be the provision of excellence and propriety and standards in public life. In fact, it would seem to be that he's highly likely to join many of your colleagues in being the exact opposite. And I rely on that commentary because I'm sure you're very familiar with Professor Moorhead and his recent Hamlin lectures, when he described lawyers as being very frail. And he went on to suggest in his first lecture that they were unreliable gods with fearless logics that drove ethical errors. In lecture 2, he suggested that they were the purveyors of extraordinary orthodoxies and legality illusions. And in his third lecture, he suggested there might be a way back. Well, which actually, if I was to be critical of him, I found very illusory, and I've yet to take him to task personally on it, but I will do eventually. But he suggested that lucidity, morality, and accountability might provide a route back. I would suggest to you that long since your profession has sold itself to the highest bidder. And they can't necessarily be faulted for that, but they're very good at it. And that runs absolutely counterthetical to any chance of provision of excellence in morality, ethics, etc. And more than that, I would suggest that they're on the rack, and that's RAC, for which you might think I was referring to a certain automotive club, but I'm actually referring to it as a need of help. And they need to understand, as we do in public life, that we need responsibility. That's the R. We need accountability. That's the A. And we need, most of all, consequence. If you do things that are wrong, you get punished. Now, we cannot have the leaders of our society who collectively, it would seem to me, have shown themselves absolutely unable to resist temptation. And in fact, everything that you said this evening speaks to that. So what we actually need is a group of people drawn from society that judge the judges, that keep them honest. It's no good thinking that the lawyers are going to do it. They never can. And by the way, as regards lawyers, I would suggest to you that they've got very muddled up between the law and justice. They pursue the law. They do not provide justice. In fact, most of the people here on this call and what Andy spends his time doing with the TTF is absolutely illustrative of that problem. So we need, I would account for, a modern day Star Chamber, but rather than drawn from the luminaries, it's drawn from the ordinary.
Mark, thank you.
And then we might get somewhere. Anyway, lecture over, because otherwise you won't be the host of this show. I will be. But anyway, I hope in the spirit of goodwill that I've caused you pause for thought, because I really see serious problems. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll just make
Go on, John.
3 points. I didn't think you were rude at all. I didn't mean to say that because Starmer was a lawyer that I thought things would get better. I meant that I thought he was procedurally driven and would abide by rules. He doesn't seem to have done so in some respects. Secondly, I think that ethical standards have fallen in the professions as well as in government, and standards in the legal profession are amongst them. I think where I would disagree with you is that I do think that our judiciary, and I know that there may be exceptions, and I know that there have been and continue to be miscarriages of justice, but I think generally our judiciary is of good repute. It's independent. You don't get the political shenanigans that you get in the US. But I agree with you that some ethical standards of lawyers is not of the highest.
Thank you very much indeed for that response. We're going to hear from David Hooper, KC. So long as David is not put off by the comments from Mark Bannister just now, I'm sure you're not. I'm sure you're not, David. Please do share your reflections on tonight's topic of conversation, and if you want to, take us into the territory of the role of the legal profession in helping to maintain good standards. If you want to go there, David. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Andy. You are promoting me. I'm not actually a KC. I'm a retired solicitor, but certainly a lawyer. I certainly agree with what John Bowers has said about the decline in ethical standards, and that there is a degree of venality in all the professions and pressures always to increase the flow of fees coming in. And I also agree with John Bowers about the standards of judiciary. I think extremely fortunate, particularly when one compares it to the system of appointment and judges being elected in America. That's the complete opposite end of the spectrum. But I do also highly recommend for anyone who hasn't read John Bowers' book reading it. This isn't perhaps the best promotion of it, but it is a sort of rather depressing read. I mean, there was a phrase that jumped out of there, which was the atmospheric pollution of our public life. But he does come up with, I think, some very good solutions. And I just like really to make a few comments of my experience, and then perhaps, if I may, end up with a question for John as to what he thinks is the best way forward. I mean, I've written about slap actions and the effect on the ethical standards that it's had on lawyers, and the problems that seem to be at the heart of all these things is how people are able to abuse power, and how we as the public should try and protect ourselves against that abuse of power. And there are so many examples in this book of how people have abused power. And the other theme that came through the examination things I wrote about was the venality of the professions, the inclination or tendency of powerful organizations, including government, to suppress freedom of speech when they can, and the tendency to cover things up. And one thinks of the infected blood scandal, the Hillsborough case, the Spycatcher case, where you have government shamelessly suppressed documents which showed that cabinet secretary had been sent out to Australia to lie. I mean, not a good thing, and no way to send somebody out to the Australian courts and let him lie. And then you see what is happening in the post office scandal, which seems to have all these things in droves. I think there's a slight danger possibly of having too many regulators, that one has off this and off that. And what I wondered, and this is really my question to John, was whether one really needs to sort of move on from Nolan, because the impression I get of Nolan, but he of course will know far more about it than I do, was that one had some fairly general and succinct principles. And I wondered whether really with the experience that we've had of all these scandals, whether one wants possibly to, and I speak really as a lawyer because that's what I know most about, what the Solicitors Regulatory Authority have done is they've sort of tried to spell out in litigation, what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And I wonder whether there should be a sort of Nolan Mark II that should, and perhaps this should be under a sort of super regulator. And if I understood it correctly, John was thinking that the sort of standards in public life might be the people to tell other regulators of the sort of principles they should be aiming to go for. But I wonder whether people should be spelling out, much more clearly and specifically, what is acceptable with people being appointed to public life. What is acceptable in rather more detail. The revolving doors. When, who is eligible for public life if they've given money to parties, because you do find as a theme of this book that a lot of the bad people have given large amounts of money, not only to political parties, but also to charities which will help them in society, perhaps give them introductions to Buckingham Palace and sort of royal charities. And I just wonder whether we really need to spell this out in a bit more detail. Sorry, it's rather a long-winded question, but
I mean,
what John's observations would be.
I mean, it's
Can I just say one other thing before you do reply? You were rather self-deprecating about being a 68-year-old dealing now with younger people, but I did see in one of the directories that you were referred to as an employment law rock star. So I don't think you should be too self-deprecating.
Thank you. Well, thank you, David. And I think that there is a link actually between your book and what we're talking about giving to political parties, because of course some of the people who have given large sums to political parties have also been behind the slap litigation. I mean, the way I look at Nolan, but I appreciate that there's other ways of looking at it, is that the principles are timeless and don't need to be updated. It's the enforcement of them that is crucial and has gone by the by. And just going back to Carolyn's observations that people can't be relied on to do the right thing and to resign or to have a sense of shame. So there needs to be some enforcement mechanism to ensure that they do. And I agree with you about that. What is and what isn't acceptable should be spelled out, although of course there'll always be unanticipated situations which are fact dependent. But I mean, what we've seen in public appointments is that there was a code that was enforced by the Commissioner for Public Appointments, and in fact it wasn't Johnson, it was during the coalition that was rolled back, and the commissioner became less of a regulator. So yeah, I think that is one of the ways to go. Yes, thank you.
I've just put a note in the chat, guys. Sorry, gentlemen. So I made the point. In my personal opinion, Nolan hasn't been defanged. It never had teeth, but it never had teeth, I think, because it was conceived and created at a time where the expectation was that people would do the right thing.
Yeah.
And that because it was the right thing to do, not because there was some law or regulation or power that would make them do the right thing. So it's almost as though we've got, how can I put this very clumsily? It's as if we've got a piece of analog thinking in a digital world. You know, it's as if we have to now recognize that if people won't do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, we do need things like Nolan to be given fangs and given teeth. Just a thought, just a thought. We're going to go to Ian Duffield. Then, of course, folks, if you want to come in with any comments or questions, just raise your hand and we'll quickly go from one person to another. Ian, as concisely as you can, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Andy. An observation and then a question, if I may. Before I retired, I was head of contracts and compliance for quite a large company. And the area where I persistently saw the worst excesses was in the area where the people involved were on a commission basis. And so the temptation to not do the right thing was governed principally by money. Now, I understand it's not the only driver behind people who don't do the right thing, but in my view, it is the biggest single driver. And this is why I think we see in the financial services arena the biggest excesses of this type of behaviour, simply because there is so much swill in the trough. And I use that parallel deliberately. Now, the case that Andy has referred to that has started today, I think involves an allegation or a suggestion that behind persuading the FCA to do the wrong thing is pressure from the Treasury for financial reasons, not necessarily financial gain personally, but for financial reasons. And that also reminds me of one of the allegations that came up in the Libor rigging scandal, where there was a suggestion that ultimately behind the Libor rigging was not the people who did it, because they weren't gaining financial personal benefit, but the push came from much, much higher indeed as far as the Treasury. And I've come over the past year or so, because of my involvement in the Woodford scandal, and by involvement I mean victim, not perpetrator, that pressure is placed on the FCA by the Treasurer, by government and by the Treasury in particular, to not do the right thing, but to do the wrong thing. So it's not necessarily personal gain by people in the Treasury, but then we look back at Andrew Bailey, who did a lot of wrong things, in my view, and his gain was the Governor of the Bank of England. So there's the financial benefit. And now I believe Nicol Rathie has been pursuing a rather senior appointment, wait for it, within the Treasury, which no doubt will enable him to get some financial benefit for once again presiding over a series of scandals where it's not just incompetence, although I think that figures very highly in the FCA's behaviour, but lack of preparedness to do the right thing because he wants to serve masters who will reward him. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I'm wondering, Mr. Bowers, sir, if you have a similar view of the Treasury involving itself in things it should not be doing for the reasons not of because it's a good thing, but because it's convenient or their political masters are pushing them to make decisions and ignore justice in favour of other aims.
Forgive me, John. I'm just going to add a bit of context to what Ian's been saying, because it's a really interesting point came out in the courtroom today. Allow me just to provide a bit of context to what Ian's just been saying and then get your thoughts. What came out in the court today is that, and this is covered by, I'm pretty sure it was James Hurley in the Times about 2 years ago. Very long story short, victims of banking misconduct wanted compensation. The Financial Conduct Authority was responsible for organising that compensation. They were in the process of doing that, and during that process, there is evidence showing, and it was mentioned in the court today, there is evidence showing that the Treasury and the banks lent on the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, to reduce the amount of compensation payable. And the bit that came out in the court today that was news to me, and this speaks to this issue of conflicts of interest. You know, normally, I'm coming around to thinking that normally when people don't behave as you'd like them to, it's because there's some kind of a conflict of interest going on. And what came out today in the court was that at the time, the UK government was part owner of some of the banks responsible, and therefore, presumably, found itself wanting, on one hand, to get these people, you know, the victims, the justice that they deserved, but on the other hand, thinking, oh my goodness me, we own these banks, therefore, well, sorry, not all of them, but we own some of these banks, therefore, we are conflicted. We want the compensation bill for the banks to be lower because it's effectively the public purse that's going to be paying the compensation. So it's just a great example. Ian's taken us to a great example of where arguably conflicts of interest are at the root of so many situations where people don't do the right thing because they're torn between different things they're trying to do. I hope that just gives a little bit more context, John, for whatever comment you'd like to make. Thank you. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about the court case today, and I don't know very much about Liebel or the Woodford case either, but I would say two things. Firstly, I think that we do have the wrong incentives in many respects. So you've got the bonus culture, which is pushing short-term gain over long-term standards. And secondly, ethical standards need to be higher across the board. This isn't just a government thing. And I do think that it's not an area that we've covered so far, but the second jobs for MPs does need to be regulated as well, because there's so many conflicts of interest there.
There really are. That's a whole story in its own. In its own. But Toshiba, of course, that's not your real name, but I'm going to call you Toshiba. My apologies to you, sir, because I know you've had your hand up for a while and I keep forgetting about it. Please do tell us what your real name is and share your thought. Thank you, Tosh. Thank you.
My name is Martin Brighton.
Thank you, Martin. Please share us your thought. Thank you.
I'm now retired, but for 25 years, during that time, I worked for a while as a lead auditor. And I was looking at the exposure of the large multinational companies to financial liability of their management systems when people are considering, usually governments, substantial contracts to them. During that time, I came across massive corruption. Yes, I was pilloried because that's how the system works. And the corruption was especially with ERDF, European Regional Development Fund money, and Objective One, where billions was involved. And it turned out, and I didn't want to believe this for months and months, that the corruption was through political direction. There was a preset agenda, and the politicians didn't care how it was achieved. So this has gone on now for 25 years, not just with European money, but it's become a culture. You mentioned earlier, Andy, about political capture. Well, capture is a internationally recognised term for institutional corruption, because all the systems that with oversight have been captured and corrupted and controlled from the top down. But John, it's not just financial institutions here. In my experience, since moving on from then, it's all of them. And we've heard from other contributors this evening that in their experience, the institutions that they've confronted have the same problems that you've been describing in the financial institutions. So it's across the board here, not just financial. And it's goes to the very heart of government. With regards, Mark Bannister, I agree with everything you've said there, especially about Mr. Starmer. This is my personal experience here, is that he is unwilling and incapable of cleaning up the system and holding past and present politicians to account. That's my opinion, based upon the last 3 years of interactions with him. Plus, before that, to put it politely, he has history where morality and the law is concerned. But I want to leave it there because I don't want it to sue me.
Yeah, of course.
What is the system? What is a solution? My personal view is only truly independent oversight with genuine power will clean this up. Totally independent of government. I don't know how that would be structured without government control. During these last 25 years and more, those who would attempt to bring government institutions to account, they are immediately subjected to a government policy which is across all the political field of control or destroy. It's to shut the people up. Now, I've had it many, many times myself. Okay, I've been threatened to have my throat cut, I've been threatened to be kneecapped, they've tried to section, all these things. So, John, your book is excellent, thank you very much. But it's more than just finance. It's much, much deeper. Mark Bannister's comments there are also, I would say, across the board as well.
Martin, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. You've made some very powerful points there. Martin, pop me an email. It'd be good to chat. I'd love to get more of an understanding of your insights. You've made some really powerful points, and obviously they're coming from a very, very authentic place, as I say, and I'd love to know more about what your lived experience has been. We'll speak, Martin. We'll speak. We're going to go from there to Robert Delner. Robert, many of you will know already. Robert's got wonderful insights, particularly around culture within financial services firms, big banks, and those sorts of things. And Robert often chips into conversations like this. He did a great job in Parliament a couple of weeks ago when we were presenting the report from the APPG. Robert, I know this type of topic is close to your heart, sir. And I'd love to hear what you'd like to say. Thank you. We would.
Thank you, Andy. And yes, this is such a complex area to try to kind of unpick and understand what is actually the drivers behind the various issues and the solutions. But I've just made a couple of notes, and I'll just sort of share those, and we can talk shortly afterwards. I mean, we live in this what we can call an alternative and post-truth culture, and as in business, you may be familiar with the saying "culture eats strategy for breakfast," which was Peter Drucker. But if we sort of look at culture as the operating principles and sort of the software of a collective psychology, then of course culture is highly context dependent, and many people have mentioned culture as sort of the endemic within the system. But culture, of course, has a relationship with ethics, morals, and the law. And the issue I think we have is also that in this highly complex, but also highly technocratic culture and society, it struggles with morals and ethics. And basically law becomes a replacement and therefore hardens, I would say, the whole atmosphere of decision making around are we inside or outside the law. And I'll turn to the PPE issue very shortly. But this downgrading or degrading of political lives towards sort of a lower denomination is covertly corrupt. I think we all kind of have seen that over many years. And I came originally from Sweden. I'm not saying Sweden is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but since living here since 1984, I've certainly seen, as other people have shared also, a sort of degradation and decline in public standards. And many of these scandals, you know, now the water companies, post office, etc., would have been sort of illegal or made illegal in other countries as well, which now refers now to the VIP lanes on PPE. To my mind, that was such a sort of overt form of corruptive policies. And I was amazed that there was no institution or organization or politician who came in and stopped that behavior. That would have been, and I know people who work in procurement, senior government in another country who said, well, that would have been illegal here. You would have had people actually stopped before it could have happened. And talking about honors, you know, the name Baroness Mohn, of course, comes into mind. What happens there is a scandal beyond scandals. And the Sunday Times, of course, suggests that the legal recourse on PPE will be very lengthy. And this is where the law, I think, has its limitations. The court system is overwhelmed, and they suggest it will be very lengthy, very difficult, and will probably not result in many convictions. And as Mark Bannister alluded to, you know, the consequences of misdemeanor does not necessarily reach the stage of justice. I had a conversation, I'm interested in your comments on this, John, with a lady, Margaret Heffernan. Some of you may know her, she's also an author. And she mentioned to me a while back that when she teaches students in politics, it seems like when she talks to them about why are you studying politics, well, it seems that it's either that or investment banking, but investment banking is now sort of on the downwards trend. So there's more money to be made in politics than previously. So now it's a sort of a commercial interest. They're not really interested in providing public services. And another author, Mariana Mazzucato, you might be familiar with her. She's also working a lot with careers in public service. And she suggests that public service is undermined by a constant government outsourcing to private enterprise in all of these things. And the PPE scandal, of course, is a very clear example of that. So why are people not really interested in politics? Well, they can be, but that's because now it's become evident that there's actually quite a lot of money to be made if you are a senior politician. And therefore unpicking the governance structures will be highly necessary. Mark Bannister mentioned, I think you call it a STAR committee or something of that order. I agree that independent oversight of this is the only way forward, because strict law, of course, is not the answer. It's not enough to change the tide in here. So coming back to Drucker maybe, but you can also say that maybe that politics eats public service for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and private interest in politics eats policies and politics for breakfast as well. Culture does not change unless you have an experience of change. It's connected with the moral code that exists. And again, in a technocratic society, we have very little of that going on, both in education and in life in general. It unfortunately only changes through either strong intervention or through a crisis. But as we saw in the financial crisis, 2008 to 2012, thereabouts, there doesn't seem to be many consequences that actually of lessons learned, or let's say a change in culture. And I think I'll leave it there in the essence of time. Thank you.
Okay, so if I could just...
Indeed, John, just to forgive me, John, just to sort of frame the next couple of minutes. I now know you need to go at 7:30 pretty sharp. Please do respond to what's just been said and give us your final comments, John, and then we'll wrap the conversation up. This is one that could roll on for hours and hours, but we'll wrap it up pretty shortly. John, back to you for your reflections on what Robert said and your final comments. Thank you.
Fascinating discussion, and in many ways quite chilling, because what you've done is to pull a lot of the strands together above and beyond the book, and I think it is linked with being in a post-truth world where facts don't seem to be accepted. I think I would just conclude by saying that I think that the culture of an institution is probably the most important, but I think that some legal intervention and enforcement is necessary, so that we don't have another situation where the rules are flouted. So if you haven't read the book, I'm just holding the book up. It's available from all good bookshops, and thank you very much. I do have to go now, but thank you very much indeed. It's been a fascinating discussion.
John, just before we go, we'll all show our appreciation to you for writing the book, spending your time with us this evening and sharing with us your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed. Can we show appreciation to John Bowers, KC? And please, John, get working on the next one. There's a part to be coming, I'm sure. Okay.
Next one's on whistleblowing, actually. So I'm sure that you'll be interested in that as well. Thank you very much.
We certainly shall be.
Thanks a lot.
Cheerio, John. Cheerio, John. John's got to dash. Folks, we'll wrap it up in just a couple of minutes. If anybody's itching any thoughts before we do, please do raise your hand now, and we'll get those final comments in before we wrap up. Otherwise, we're good to close. It's been a lovely conversation. It's taken us into all kinds of nooks and crannies. I personally don't feel any more confident that things are going to turn around for the good unless something makes it happen. I've really quite bought into what Mark Bannister said earlier about, was it responsibility, accountability, and consequence? Mark really emphasized the consequence bit when he said his points. Anybody for any final comments? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. 3, 2, 1. Oh, Mark Bannister, you've got the final word. Keep it brief, Mark. Back to you.
No, Leonard wants to have a word, I think. So that's what I was drawing your attention to.
Oh, you're very kind. Leonard, please do. I'm not seeing everybody on my screen, so forgive me. I've done a lousy job seeing people's hands go up. Thanks, Mark. It's very helpful. Leonard, please do check in with your thoughts. Thank you. Thank you. If you can take yourself off mute. I'm guessing you're on mute because I can't hear you. Mr. Leonard Splendiff.
Sorry.
Sorry,
I just wanted to know the title of the book.
Oh, for goodness sake. So the title of the book is is Downward Spiral, and let me put a link in the chat to it where you can go and get it, sir.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Downward Spiral. I'm just putting it in the chat. Bear with me, folks. We did earlier, but we'll do it again.
Andy, while you're just doing that,
Yeah.
I'd like to sort of bend everybody's ear. I really do think that we have ourselves to blame for all of this. And we need to provide the solution as a consequence. We cannot expect our politicians to provide it, nor any of our other leaders, because I don't know whether you saw the comment I made in the chat, but the reality is that you cannot get to the top without compromising yourself en route, and that I don't care what areas of expertise you apply that to. That's the sad reality. You've got to be sharper, faster, and better than everybody else to get to the top. And once you've done that, you've compromised yourself to get there. And somebody will know about it, somebody will lean on you, and that's the root cause of much of this. And the other thing I would say is we all know about the slippery pole. Well, the pole is indeed slippery, and therefore you have to grab on and hold on very tight. And in order to do that, again, you compromise yourself. You cannot maintain your position without fighting off others. The whole concept of what we think leadership is all about and how it should operate allied to ethics and morality is a very compromised thought in and of itself. And until we recognize that, we won't solve the problem either. So that's the end of it. Anyway, thanks for listening.
Mark, thank you. I find myself going to a place we often get to at the end of our meetings, which is talking about the decay in our democracy as a whole. We often end up concluding that there's something fundamentally wrong with our democracy, the quality of our democracy, the true representation of the people seems to be lacking in our democracy. There's a democracy deficit or a democracy decay. I don't really know how to describe it, but there are so many things going wrong. If you think about what the common denominators are, so much of it seems to come down to the democratic process being disconnected from what the people really want and need it to be. That's clearly another topic for another time. We'll wrap up our conversations tonight. It's been great hearing all the thoughts and opinions. Particular thanks, of course, to John Bowers, KC, David Hooper, Carolyn Heyman, Robert Delner, Mark Bannister, Ian Duffield, and everyone else who's had a chance to chip in. For those of you that may not have had a chance to share your thoughts, please don't hesitate to pop me an email. And Martin, I've asked Alexandra to fix up some time for you and I to speak on Zoom, because I'll be very keen to get a better understanding of your insights. You made your points in a particularly poignant way, and you've got my attention. On that note, folks, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Let's give ourselves a round of applause for participating and having the courage to have the conversation in the first place. Cheerio all. Good night. Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.